Hello. Welcome back to episode 3 of My Podcast and I, a podcast.
My podcast and I. Take 2.
My therapist and I. No, that's going in. I'm not editing this. No way. Welcome back to episode 3 of My Therapist and I, a podcast that is not just about therapy, it is therapy. More specifically, my therapy, and you get to be the fly in the wall and observe and listen from the privacy of wherever it is you listen from. As you may be able to tell, I'm not on my game today, as made evident by the lack of title naming. But we're going to press through. I am joined by my podcast therapist, Dr. Steve Harris.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So I was thinking more about our first 2 episodes, and then you and I had talked about like, hey, there's this kind of interesting dynamic here where typically clients would show up to your environment, you know, and then they'd sit down and you would kind of start things off. Whereas here,
I run the show.
Yeah,
I run the show in my therapy office, right?
And now you don't run the show.
Yeah, in some ways I don't, and in other ways I do, right?
So I was thinking about this. How I think we should, or we could, address this is in future episodes, we do kind of the intro and then tackle housekeeping if there's any housekeeping items in order, and then pass it over to you, and you can, as you normally do, or as you feel comfortable, do your kind of like, so Alex, last time you told me that X, Y, and Z, or I don't know. I'm not, you know.
Yeah, I actually typically don't start there. One of the things that I worry about is taking the therapy session in a direction that I want to see it, whereas I really want to make the space available for where my client wants to see it. So I'm more likely to start a session by saying, hey, what's on your mind about our work together?
Beautiful. I love hearing that, and I wholeheartedly agree. And I think my favorite aspect of therapy is the fact that I get to talk about whatever it is that I want.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Whether it is a cloud I saw in the sky that looked like a certain animal and that sent me down a rabbit hole of thoughts, or, you know, something more serious. But anyway, that's cool. I want to start with the housekeeping because there is something that I think it would do the listeners justice to have a bit more insight as to who they're dealing with here. Not to put you on the spot, Dr. Steve. And I'm also, side note, I think I'm going to call you Steve or Dr. Steve. I'm going to rotate between those two. Is that cool with you?
That's great.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to start out by embarrassing you a little bit, Dr. Steve. But so Dr. Steve's kind of a big deal is what I'm learning. The more research that I do on you and the more I talk to people, the more I realize that, you know, this guy knows his stuff. So I think it would be helpful to, I mean, I can tell you about what I read, and then you could tell me if it's true or false. And then also I think it would be helpful for you to kind of just talk about in a least awkward way possible why you are kind of a big deal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, but I'm already uncomfortable. So if this were my session, or, you know, if I was running the show, I wouldn't allow you to do this.
Yeah.
So, no, that's not true, entirely true.
Yep.
But
I think for the sake of those listening, it is important to understand that, you know, Dr. Stephen Harris is very good at what he does. Is my understanding you're tenured at 2 universities? Is that correct?
Well, I started my university career at Texas Tech University out in Lubbock, Texas, and I got tenure there. And then, you know, when you transfer tenure, when you go to take another academic job, you carry that tenure with you, so to speak. But you have to get it granted at the new institution as well. So,
also a lot of peer, what do they call peer reviewed?
Peer reviewed publications.
A lot of those.
Yeah.
To the tune of I found Dr. Stephen Harris's resume. It's online.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's 39 pages long, which that's like 38 pages longer than my resume. Just for, but a lot of peer reviewed stuff, which I think is really cool. But I guess where I want to get to is, and this was told to me by a former student of yours, so they're a little bit biased. But you were the department head at the marriage and family therapy program at the U of M. Is that correct?
Yeah, program director.
Program director.
Not department head, but yeah.
Oh, sorry. That's what I meant to say. And that program's, I mean, he was saying it was one of the best in the country, if not kind of globally renowned.
It has a really good reputation.
I didn't know that.
Not because of me, but because of people who came before me. I mean,
sure.
Yeah, I'm fortunate to kind of bask in some of that. So
yeah, but I didn't realize that program had that kind of, weight in the.
Yeah,
like the U of M is one of the, it's a premier.
It's a big name. It's a premier. Yeah, so.
That's cool. Is there? Again, I apologize for this. Is like the every Minnesotan's worst nightmare, right?
Yeah, I'm realizing that right now, and I'm not even from here, but
yeah, this is like what we dread. But the point I wanted to get across is, your stuff, and to anyone listening, we're not just kind of winging this here. I mean, we are in some sense, but in another sense. You're in good company, is what I would like to say.
I appreciate that, but I mean, there are a lot of good therapists out there, a lot of bad therapists out there as well. But yeah, I've been doing this for a long time too, 30 years or so. And so you pick up a couple things here and there after 30 years. So
yeah, I hope to get to that point where I pick up something. I've been around for 30 plus years and I'm still waiting to pick up that something. Okay, so housekeeping done. Dr. Steve thoroughly embarrassed and made to feel awkward.
Yeah.
Is there anything on that note you would like to add?
Yeah, I think that, when Alex, when you approached me, you got my name, when you approached me about this idea, I think one of the things in trying to get out of it, I think I said to you, I work mostly with couples.
Yes.
So, I really feel like my training, my expertise is with couples and relationships. And so I think I even told Alex I'm less likely to be the kind of therapist that has a client for a long period of time and, for years on end. And if it's an individual, typically couples and families that I work with, the therapy goes pretty quickly. My own philosophy is that you shouldn't be in therapy forever. Like you should go out and live your life for a little bit. You could go into therapy to get some information, but that depends on what you're wanting to talk about. Some people need to be in therapy longer than 7 to 10 sessions. And so
that in of itself is very interesting because that is a pain point that I have had in therapy before, which is like, when does this end?
Yeah.
And I found myself saying that in a session, like, am I going to be like this forever? Am I going to be 82 years old and kind of on my walker, like walking into a therapist's office and they're going to be like, hey, do you want to lie down on the couch? I'll be like, I can't, because if I do, I won't be able to get back up.
Right.
So like, is there an end? And from my experience, the majority of therapy work I have done, the response I've gotten is like, well, there's no right answer. And it's refreshing to hear like, well, it doesn't have to be forever. Like it can be short. So that's cool. Okay. Well, that's housekeeping. So I'm going to kick it off to you so you can use the almighty intro line.
So, Alex, what's on your mind about our work together?
Steve, I'm glad you asked.
Okay.
I have the last session we had, you posed a question. I don't know if it was rhetorical or not, but you encouraged me to find my Google Maps.
Yeah, that's right.
That was a tough question. And I have honestly been struggling with that answer because I was trying to think of like, okay, well, what does he mean? And what's the right way to answer that question? As I was going through that, I started to be like, okay, dude, there's no way that he had a very specific answer in mind. It was probably more broad. Where I have landed in terms of my Google Maps, like I look at it like this way. What are aspects of my life that are important to me, and what are things I want to achieve in those elements of my life? So, for example, I kind of narrowed it down to 3. One is like personal, one is professional, and then one is creative. And so personally, my goals are just to be as good of a human as I can, in the sense of like, okay, I want to have a healthy relationship with my fiance, soon to be my wife. I want to be a good father. I want to cultivate as healthy relationships as I can and surround myself with people where it's like, okay, our interactions are pleasant, they're good, like, etc. Professionally, and this is where it gets challenging, right? It's like, where do I want to go? I want to be successful. I just don't know how to articulate that without being like, okay, do I need to set like annual revenue goals? And like, is that my Google map for that? But when I got to the creative element, which is tied into my profession because it's what I do, that's where I started to get a little more clarity, because it's like, I feel like I'm at my best when I'm creating things that I think people are going to engage with in a positive way. Mm-hmm. A good example is this podcast. Like, this kind of work is what calms me down and be like, okay, dude, like, we're on the right path. It's fine. Where I get tripped up, though, is that I feel like there's this societal pressure, like this other voice that represents society, which is like, okay, that's all fun and good, Alex, but you need to make money and you need to provide and you need to build, a legacy and blah, 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 blah. And I often find myself getting pulled between like, okay, I'm doing work that brings me joy and I want to focus on that feeling, but also like, hey, I can't, I have to point to some kind of success so that people don't judge me and think I'm like a bum.
Okay.
So that's where I landed on my answer to what my Google Maps is.
Yeah, so you've outlined the three areas, right?
Yeah.
Your kind of personal, your career,
yeah,
right? And creative.
Yeah.
And the commonality is they all involve you. You're the epicenter of all of those things. Those things go out from.
Which, is that a bad thing? Like, is that kind of...
No.
Okay.
No, I think that's the way it is. But I see you in relationship to all those things. Well, you're in kind of the center, and then you've got this my personal realm, my professional realm, and this creative. And I think all those things are connected in some way. I started thinking about because you get a voice that says to you, hey, you've got to be a productive member of society. There's certain things you've got to do, right? And in therapy, we tell people you should on yourself, right? Like why
should myself so much.
You're putting expectations. So we would ask, where do those expectations come from? And when you start saying I should be this way, sometimes those come from a personal ethic, a family ethic. Sometimes those are informed by our cultural background or our ethnic identity, or a religious perspective. And when you talked about I should be out making money, there are some people who kind of embrace the world in a kind of there's a theory of abundance, right? Like there's enough for everyone here. There's enough for me to develop a podcast and put it out there, and it'll do what the universe wants it to do. Like it'll gain traction or it won't gain traction. So to me, that's part of the Google map as well. Do I believe that if I'm engaged in doing the things that I want to do, that good things will follow? I'll be able to pay my bills. But as I'm saying that, I'm also thinking about, I heard Mark Cuban the other day talk about, the worst business advice or the worst career advice you could ever give somebody is follow your passions. He goes, if I had done that, I'd still be trying to play basketball, and I don't have the talent to play at the level I want to play at or would like to be at. So I don't know. My sense is that you've started to identify part of your Google Maps, your inner compass, or your Google Maps, but something's running Google Maps, right? It's a compass that says, here's where everything is. And what is your inner compass? What is the thing when you strip everything down that you stand for, that you...
Yeah. I get a feeling like as I listen to you talk about that, I get more clarity in terms of like, I know what drives me and I know what I like to do. And not to get into this kind of abstract realm of like my purpose or why I was put on this world, because, that's another conversation in and of itself. But I have a general clarity in the sense of like, I go back to what I said earlier. I truly enjoy creating and I truly enjoy making things that allow people to think and to feel and to laugh and to experience stuff. That brings me joy. Like when I shared this podcast to some people and they were like, this is really great. I love this. I shared it with someone. I told you this. She texted me. She's like, I started crying, like that, not in a bad, not like, cause it was so, awful.
Oh, it moved her.
Yeah. It moved her.
Yeah.
Like though that kind of work, I will always, be motivated. Like it will always drive me. And I love balancing this notion of like self-expression, but also trying to kind of crack the giant egg that is the human experience and decode that in a way for people to like be like, oh yeah, this is true. I hadn't thought about this and I like thinking about this and it makes me feel better to think about it. Like I love doing that. However you want to describe that work. That's kind of my creative, that's what fuels me.
Yeah. And I hear, I want to move people. I want to have impact. I want what I do to be relevant.
Yeah.
And and you get a certain payment out of that that's not related to money or anything.
That is where I get tripped up because there's this stupid voice that's like, that is naive, or like,
yeah,
you got to be realistic. And I understand, I've done a lot of work. I understand that this voice in therapy, that this voice is not, I don't know exactly where it comes from, but like, I just wish it wasn't so damn persistent. Like it seems to always be there. And there are certain days where it's like, okay, I can quiet it down. But then there are other days where it's like much louder and it's just so distracting and challenging to have to like deal with this like all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you figure that out, would you let me know? Because I think that's the $64,000 question for people, right? Because there's this inner voice, there's this thing that there's these doubts, there's these outside pressures and things like that. So tapping into your inner compass, your Google map, is part of it. But just because you've done that doesn't mean you're not going to get pushback or not.
It's so fascinating to me. Like I don't understand the evolutionary gain to like having a part of your brain like convince you not. Well, I guess out of self-preservation.
Yeah, fear, right?
Yeah.
Don't go there. You're going to ruin everything. You're going to lose what you had.
Which, like, it's really trippy to know that, to be aware of it. It's kind of like I feel like I'm sometimes trying to hack my brain. Like, my brain is a piece of hardware, and it has these certain, like, parameters where it's like, okay, if you go up against this wall, it's going to get upset. Mm-hmm. And I find myself trying to, like, wire around that. So it's like, hey, I know this is a primitive response system to keep me safe. However, I am safe right now, so we don't need to freak out.
Right. Talk yourself down. Right.
But it just seems so like it confounds me as to like why this process has to exist, in the first place, why my brain can't be like, yeah, you got to figure it out. Totally. Go for it.
But does that process, my guess is that process exists in every facet of your life, from eating breakfast to driving to work. And so, but there are some parts of it that, like, say, maybe you've mastered eating breakfast. And so it's no longer this, like, should I do this or should I do that? Or don't do this. But there are these other things that are more risky, or they're more about putting yourself out there, or that do kind of hook that inner dialogue about, this is a risk. Are you sure you want to do this? And like, when I think about what you've said about the things you want to do, I think, do with your life and what you want to be, what you want to stand for, it's about relationships. And maybe that's just because that's what I work with primarily.
No, it is.
And I want to see that
in you.
But it's about relationships and about moving people. And at the end of the day, you say, I want to create, I want to impact, and I want to move people. I want to help people find meaning.
That is accurate. That is 100% accurate. And
I'm gonna start writing fortune cookies.
It makes you wonder, like, does a human still do that, or is that robots now? Is there like just one? Is like the Wizard of Oz? There's like one machine.
Oh, writing fortune cookies.
Yes, correct.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well,
yeah, write it. Sorry, writing fortune cookies. Yeah, That is kind of my Google Maps, and when I focus on that, I feel better. It's just, I guess, to make an analogy, that there's that lingering voice that's like, yeah, but like, look, we're in the woods, and like, if we fall off the trail, we could be in trouble. But on that note, I was learned of this phrase like urgency versus emergency, which was used to like explain like, your brain is assuming it's an emergency when it's not. Like, I'm not, to go back to my example of being lost in the woods, right. My ultimate fear was like, okay, if we go off the trail, like we could potentially, in theory, on a very extreme sense, like die, because we could get lost,
right?
No food, blah, blah, blah. So that was the fear. But in this instance, it's like my career. It's like there's no immediate threat. It's just rather a sense of urgency. But my brain continues to be like, nope, emergency. And I want it to be like, shh, like you're safe. Everything's fine.
But I also think, like, going back to the you and Haley, right, on the trail.
Yeah, my wonderful, beautiful fiance, Haley.
If part of what you want to be and do is to move people, like at your core, if what you want every interaction to be is to move people, is to be meaningful, is to, enhance relationship.
Yeah.
The last thing you wanted to do was to go out there and have some kind of a blunder that
correct
results in a negative experience that puts distance between the two of you, that she goes, oh my gosh, he's horrible with a map, or paints you in a different kind of light than you want to be painted in.
Yes, 100%.
So, like, I think your Google map shows up in everything. I think your compass shows up in everything. And like I said, that can be influenced from a variety of different places. A lot of people find it in religious or spiritual beliefs or connection to something greater than them. It gives them purpose or gives them identity.
I wanted to kind of meander into that realm because you had, I don't recall exactly how you phrased it, but you said something to the effect of like, do you believe that if you focus on this path and you keep down it, like good things will come? And that kind of is something that I've been struggling with. I've struggled with my whole life, is this notion of like, you describe it as, or one could describe it as just faith that things will be okay, right? Like, I've always been a very rational person in the sense of like, okay, I need more evidence. And if unfortunately in my instance, it's like I need an abundance of evidence. In fact, I could have so much evidence and still be like, well, it's not a guarantee. Just a very inherently skeptical person. But something that I find myself wishing that I had and being envious of people who have it is like people, I don't know if you know them, like who they're just like, yeah, everything's going to be okay. Like, I have a plan, I'm going to stick to it, and it'll work out. I know it will.
Yeah, they don't get frustrated. They don't get flustered. They don't get rattled.
Yeah. And I find myself like being like, damn, that would be so nice to be like that. And I don't know if it's like a skill one can practice, but there's something to be said about this, like being able to have faith.
It's probably, my guess is it's probably a both and kind of a thing. Like, you're probably born with a certain temperament. I watch this in the way my daughter is parenting her child. Way less concerned about the amount of mess and more concerned about the amount of the kind of experience her kid is having. Whereas I was more like, you're going to do that on the carpet, and so she's got something from her life that she's allowing her kids to live in a more freeing environment than I think I was willing to let her grow up in. So that, I was more worried about the mess, more worried about the work that it's going to take me to undo whatever my kid's doing. And I watch my daughter parent her kids, and I'm like, wow, she's just way more chill. And I see that's probably a good thing for her kids. I
was raised in a very much like, oh, you're going to do that on the carpet kind of environment. So I know, this is the running joke. It always goes back to the parents. Everything.
Darn them.
What have they done to me? But that was kind of the environment I grew up in, was like, I didn't experience a ton of examples of like, it'll be fine. It was always like, well, we need to have a plan, because if we don't have a plan, things could go wrong and that will be on us, as opposed to something I'm trying to experiment with now is like, maybe like I'm trying to shift my brain away from outcomes, right? Like, and more
Right.
on like, okay, what's stuff you can control, focus on that stuff, and the rest is the cards are going to kind of fall as they may. But there are times where I'm like, that the voice again is like, that's what someone would say who doesn't have a plan. Like, if you would have planned more, you wouldn't have to rely on saying things like that, Alex. So it's just like a constant struggle there, which it can be exhausting, but
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I think that's a temperament thing. People are more laid back. I see it in my own kids. I've got 4 kids. Some of them are more laid back. Some of them are more uptight. They worry about different things, and so figuring out who you are, figuring out, am I the kind of person that should I be worrying about this, or is it okay for me to be more casual? And
so like being okay, like for example, I could be like, hey, my temperament is just to be kind of an anxious person in the sense of like, it's going to be natural for my brain to run around and worry about all these things. And that's fine. Just let it do its thing versus like being, I guess, upset with my brain for the way that it is.
yeah, I mean, the person that came to my mind, and this is probably showing my age, but is Woody Allen. Like he is, I believe, as neurotic as they come.
Yeah.
But he's channeling that into a character of somebody who's neurotic, and his films are about this neurotic person, and so he's figured out a way to make his craziness work for him, or his challenges, his struggles. He's embracing them in such a way that they work for him. I'm not going to say let's all pattern our lives after Woody Allen.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
But there's something about knowing yourself, embracing it, changing the things you can. This is kind of like the the serenity prayer that we, people say at the end of an AA meeting. Help me to know the difference between the things I can change and the things I can't change.
What's crazy is that serenity prayer, I first was exposed to it as a 11, 12-year-old at tennis camp. We would say that prayer. Yeah, and it was only later I realized that that's what they say at AA meetings too. And I remember thinking that's kind of fascinating. But I always liked that prayer, right? It's allowing me to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and then wisdom to know the difference.
Right.
And that is a really profound thing. And I guess where I get tripped up is, it kind of goes back to what you said earlier, which is if my brain is being the way that it is, I start shoulding it, which is like, I should not be thinking this way. I should not be experiencing this. The fact that I am experiencing this means that something is wrong. And if I'm being completely honest, I think that's what kind of initially drove me to therapy was when I was a kid. I mean, granted, I had more like things I wanted to sort out. I knew just based on like my behavior and kind of the situations I was getting into. But there's always been this like, your brain shouldn't be spitting out these questions or these thoughts or these, so you should go talk to someone. But maybe it's just doing its thing. It's just being an Alex brain.
Maybe. And so let's say you do go to therapy, then the question comes back to what we were talking before. How do you know when you're done? Like if I get to the place where I finally realize this is just my Alex brain, this is just my Steve brain, can I get a refund? Like what do I?
Yeah, because it's like,
can I be okay with being me?
Yeah, and I think I get so frustrated because like I find myself stressing over these problems, right? Let's quote unquote, we'll call them problems. I have a problem with X, and I'm like, it's got to be complicated because in order for it to stump me, it has to be complicated. But then towards the end, I realize it's never complicated. It's typically like as simple as just being like accepting who you are, which is like the most fundamental principle of being a human. You start hearing that when you're like 8 years old, right? And to think that after all of these years, I might be just dealing with a fundamental human existence problem frustrates me because it's like, well, I guess I'm not as smart as I thought I was. It's just the old love who you are deal. But in my brain, I try to be like, no, there's got to be some deep rooted, there's got to be societal elements, shame, toxic shame, blah, 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 blah. And that's not to say that, that exists, but it's so interesting how, like, I feel like everyone's collective, let's call it suffering, can come down to just a few experiences that we all share, right? One of them being like, we're kind of not sure if we should accept who we are in terms of our strengths, our flaws. Who's to even say that they are flaws? Maybe they're not flaws. Maybe we should stop calling them flaws to begin with. They're just aspects of my brain.
Of who you are, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was, so that's Google Maps. I think the Google Maps question was a good one because it's something that I struggle with on a daily basis. Not struggle with, but
So when in here in our podcast therapy office,
Yep.
when I say something like, it feels to me like what Alex is about is wanting to be create things, create movement in people. You want to move people. You want to be associated with meaningful things.
yeah.
And you identify that, you're like, yeah, that is me. That's the fortune cookie. That's who I am, right? Is that like when you get to a point where you're having to make a decision, do you default to that? Do you go in your mind and say, I'm the Alex who wants to move people. I'm the Alex who's about relationships. And if it's not checking these boxes, then I don't do it. Like, there's a reason you're doing what you're doing and you're not on Wall Street.
Yes.
Buying and selling commodities. This sounds like torture to you, right?
Correct. Like, to that end, I don't know how many people have done this, but I went through the entire process of applying to law school except for actually hitting submit on my applications. I took the LSAT, I wrote all the essays, I filled out every application, I got all my letters of rec, and all I had to do was press the button, and I couldn't do it. So that hopefully shed some light. But there are also instances, I heard you ask that question, and the first thought in my mind was, well, no, I don't always default to that. I sometimes default to the voice that's like, hey, let's be smart about this.
Got to make money, got to pay the bills. Mm-hmm.
But as you continued to talk, and you're like, well, clearly you're not on Wall Street. It's like, well, that's true. I have, I should give myself some credit. I have, for the most part, acted in accordance with this voice. Mm-hmm. There was a reason why I left, my agency. Like, I walked away from a very, I don't want to say cushy, but the plan was very paved. It was a paved path, and there wasn't a lot of shrubbery to get lost in. Like, it was a path, and it was set out, and many people had walked on it before. It was very certain. And it also was not for me. And I acted on that voice then. And I've continually done that. And
right, because for you, it wasn't generating meaning.
Correct.
It wasn't moving you.
Yeah.
It was checking some of the boxes, and maybe important boxes, paying bills, things like that.
Yes.
And maybe you had meaningful relationships with coworkers and things like that. But for whatever reason, it didn't seem like it was checking all the important boxes.
So, I do act on that voice, and then I guess some anxiety stems from, like, there are times where I temper it a little bit, or I don't know. I try to apply reason to this, like, Alex filter, or quote unquote reason. Yeah. It's kind of like, like, I'm not full artist or like full creative, I guess, where it's like someone who, like Kanye West, who, like, they literally, like, create their own world and everyone else just exists in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I find myself navigating this tightrope of, like, I want to balance creativity and art with, like, society. And I want to have one foot in each, like, firmly rooted in both. And I think that, like, dichotomy is sometimes, because they can kind of pull in different directions.
Yeah. Do you feel like you do that, though? Like, are you meeting that?
I would think so. Yeah. like, and how I answer this, and you can tell me what you think of this, but like my mind immediately went to like, if you went to anyone who knows me, they'd be like, yeah, Alex is a creative person, and like he also is pretty grounded, and he's successful, and you know he isn't like off the deep end by any means.
Mm-hmm. So is that the criteria? Like if I can do all that with not going off the deep end in any way, not going too extreme one way or the other.
I guess like just because in terms of creativity, I've always had this like stereotype of who I don't want to be, which is like the suffering artist, you know, like the Van Gogh or like the
keep your ears.
Yeah, right. And there's always that, I don't want to say romanticism, but you know, it's like, well, if you want to be an artist, you have to suffer and you have to be crazy and no one can understand you, and you have to be so totally self-involved, and like I don't like those aspects. Like I want to be a functioning member of society. I want to have positive impacts on people's lives, and you know, I'd like to travel with my wife and be able to. I want it all, Steve. Like, why? I just want everything. That's all. I don't know.
Well, Alex, without knowing you really well, this is our third time being together. You seem like you might have it all.
Yeah, which
makes me wonder why you're in therapy here.
So this is a really, really great segue to all right, the kind of next thing I wanted to talk about, which was when we were giving this. So let me give you a timeout. Are we segueing into a new session right now? Nope.
Or no?
Nope.
Okay.
We are not.
See, once again, I'm not in control. This would be a place where I'd be like, you hold on to that and let's start up there next time.
Yeah. I was sharing this podcast out, and a piece of feedback that I got from someone was they were like, I really like it, and I shared it with my friend, and my friend said the same thing I was thinking, which is like, it's fun, it's it's interesting, but you're not really dealing with any problems,
right?
And I was like, well, yeah, like, and then she was like, I'm in therapy, and like I deal with real stuff. You're kind of dealing. I think she described it as garden variety therapy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I remember hearing that and be like, yeah, that's true. That's kind of the point of the podcast. But I also found myself feeling kind of embarrassed, like right away. And my friend had no intention of like making me feel embarrassed.
That wasn't intentional.
Not at all. But my mind went there because I was like, well, yeah, I don't want to give off the impression that like this podcast is about dealing with heavy stuff. Because, maybe that happens, but most likely it doesn't. Like, but I found myself being like, well, shoot, I'm going to be judged by the lack of problems I have in my life. Like, I just worried that someone had this voice of like, wow, he thinks like these are issues. I've got real issues. They're X, Y, and Z. And the thought of like comparing, issues made me really uncomfortable and kind of embarrassed, because it's like, yeah, I hope it doesn't come across that I'm like, that I would compare what I'm dealing with someone, let's say, who's going through some like really intense physical trauma and healing that.
Physical or mental, emotional trauma. Exactly. I mean, you said one time, I might go to therapy and I might say, hey, I saw this cloud and it reminded me of this and got me thinking this way. But I've never had a client come in and say something like that. It's always been like, my husband and I are at each other's throats, or we're, like, I'm really concerned about my child. My child's using drugs, or I'm concerned my kid's just not sleeping through the night, and I don't know how to parent. And there are heavy things, and so I think that you and I still are trying to decide how deep do we go with this podcast. What are the big things? Because people typically don't go to therapy unless there's something really big.
Yeah,
people don't typically go in and say, I'd like to go and philosophize about life and the vicissitudes of life, right?
Yep.
And the place where you and I think, both connected on this idea was, what could either one of us do? Could we do together to expand the conversation of mental health and accessing mental health treatment? And if part of what we're doing with this podcast is, sitting kind of in an ivory tower talking about the meaning of life and things like that, I think a lot of people will be like, well, is that what therapy is? Because I need help with my kid, or I need help with my drug addiction, or I can't seem to give up porn and it's ruining my relationship. So, yeah. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And the reason I had come up originally with the idea for the podcast was because I had encountered a lot of people in my life who, the more, and I think you and I talked about this, the more I shared with them what I gathered from therapy, gained from therapy, and the kinds of things that we talked about, the more open to the idea of therapy they became. And something that I think is true based on observations is that a big barrier to entry for therapy for people is this idea of like, well, if I go to therapy, I'm going to have to confront some really heavy, intense stuff. And I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to go. Like, to make an analogy, it's like there are people who think that, like, if you were to go to the gym, you would have to bench press 1,000 pounds and you'd have to run 15 miles each time, right? Which is like, that's not true. Like, you can show up to the gym and like walk on a treadmill for 5 minutes. You still went to the gym. You're still better for it. And I really I want to attack the stigma that like therapy has to be this intense, scary, hard thing. Like, yes, you can dive into really intense stuff, but you can go at your own pace. And if you need to start out slow, that's totally fine. It can still be really beneficial. You can talk about your life, your relationships, and you can gather strength from that.
And at the same time, I totally agree with what you're saying. And at the same time, if you get a therapist who's a good therapist, they're going to say to you eventually, "Is this what we're talking about? Are you okay with this level of conversation, or is there a deeper reason that you came, or is there another thing that we should be talking about that's been hard for you to talk about? Are we checking the box?"
In my experience with therapy, when I first started out, I would come in with things that were kind of, again, garden variety, or I don't want to use the term superficial because that sounds judgmental, but like on the surface, they didn't seem like big deals. And the therapist always did a great job of being like, so tell me more, like, what else was going on there? And they dig a little deeper and a little deeper. And that's where we would get to the real stuff, the big stuff. But it was never like, we would just dive in. So
right.
I agree with you too. It's like therapists know how to pick up on like, ooh, I think there's something there.
Right.
I'm going to go a little bit deeper, as opposed to like, it doesn't have to be on the patient to be like, okay, here's why I'm here. I'm ready to talk about it. Because a lot of people, I don't know if maybe they are ready. Maybe in your experience, you found that people like open up immediately and they just kind of dive right in.
I think I've had a gamut of experiences, some who do and some who don't. The therapist has their own Google map as well, right?
Yeah.
When I'm training therapists, I'm like, why are you asking this question instead of asking 100 other questions that you could ask at this moment? What is driving you, and how does the therapist's own beliefs and their own experiences and their relationships and stuff, how does that govern how they show up and how they attend to what you might be saying or ignore other things that you might say?
Yeah. Well, to that end, I mean, and again, it kind of, to go back why I brought it up, like, I definitely do not want, I think something that frightens me and scares me is this idea that it might come across that I'm like, you mentioned the ivory tower, like, oh, woe is me. Like, I do not want someone to listen to this and be like, oh, he's complaining about stuff that, doesn't really matter. And right. That's a deep, that's a fear that I have. Like, that would make me feel ashamed, kind of, right? And and I really hope that it doesn't come across as me trying to set up comparisons. More so, my hope is that it gives people a glimpse of like the kinds of things you can talk about in therapy if you're not ready to talk about really heavy stuff.
Right. And I think that it's complicated in this podcast therapy room because we are still doing the things that a therapist and client do. We're still feeling each other out.
Yeah.
We're still getting to know each other.
Yeah.
When someone starts opening up to me as a therapist, I start becoming more connected to that person.
Yeah.
I start to have a relationship. I start to develop feelings for that person, love, admiration, respect, empathy and sympathy for what they've been going through. I don't have that the moment I show up. That's something that develops through the therapeutic relationship. And so you and I are still kind of, I think, feeling each other out, feeling out the purpose of what we're doing. Are we in sync on the purpose? And we have these dual roles, right? You're the producer of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I'm this therapist type of person here. We've been really clear about you have another therapist where you'll go deeper. But I think you're also kind of feeling me out and going, how deep do I want to go with Steve? How deep do I want to go with the masses? Who's going to hear this? And when you go to therapy, it all stays in that room.
Yes.
But here we hit send, and it's
the room is very big.
Yeah,
on this
it's on Spotify or it's on
yes,
I don't wherever people get their podcasts. So,
and that is something that it is a great adventure.
Yeah, or a scary one.
It is a scary one, but again, as long I'd really appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, I think we are feeling it out, and I don't want to say I love the adventure, but like to me it's a worthwhile one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because I keep thinking, I had this one friend who was so hesitant to go to therapy, but I could tell they were in a lot of pain, actual physical pain from a traumatic accident. And I kept just kind of giving examples of things I'd been talking with my therapist about and how it had helped me and blah blah. Slowly but surely I got him to go, and he called me one day and he was like, he was doing so much better. And it's like, if this great experiment leads to just 1 or 2 or 3 examples of that, that's fine. I can be judged by 85 people if 2 people are like, hey, this was really helpful, and thanks for doing it. That's kind of my POV.
Yeah, so that's that's Alex, right? I want to move people. I'm willing to put myself out there. I'm willing to invest so that I can move people, so that I can be an agent of movement, an agent of impact.
Yeah. I don't know if you just heard this, just a drilling sound.
Yeah.
This is the perfect time to wind down this episode.
Okay.
Sometimes you got to take cues from life, Mother Nature, and the sounds of drilling. So yeah, thank you. As always, I think we should also work on an outro. Maybe I'll say something and then I'll kick it over to you, and then you can do the, hey, that's our time.
That's a wrap. I've got to see somebody else next. I mean, yeah, we'll have to figure that. We'll have to work on that.
Yeah, but thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you at the next episode. All right.
All right.
Later.